In September 1961, deep in the heart of Africa, a handful of young Irish soldiers found themselves staring down the barrels of 3,000 enemy troops. What followed was 5 days of hell that would test every ounce of courage, tactical brilliance, and sheer determination these men possessed. This is the story of the Siege of Jadotville, where 156 Irish peacekeepers faced impossible odds and delivered a military masterclass that still echoes through history books today. The year was 1961, and the world was a powder keg. The Cold War raged across continents, turning every conflict into a chess match between superpowers. In the newly independent Democratic Republic of the Congo, chaos reigned supreme. Just over a year after gaining independence from Belgium, the mineral-rich province of Katanga had declared itself a separate nation under the leadership of Moise Tshombe. But this wasn't just another African independence struggle. This was about uranium. The same uranium that had powered the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki now lay beneath the red earth of Katanga, making it one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate on the planet. Into this volatile mix stepped the United Nations, desperate to maintain peace and prevent the Congo from becoming another Cold War battleground. Among their peacekeeping forces were soldiers from a small island nation that had only recently emerged from centuries of colonial rule itself. Ireland, barely 40 years independent, was sending its sons to Africa as part of the 35th Infantry Battalion. These young men, most of them teenagers and 20-somethings, had no idea they were about to write one of the most remarkable chapters in military history. The mining town of Jadotville sat like a jewel in the crown of Katanga's mineral wealth. Its uranium deposits were considered the world's most important source, and control of this town meant control of resources that could shift the balance of global power. The atmosphere was electric with tension as Belgian mining companies, European mercenaries, and local Katangese forces all vied for influence. White settlers watched nervously as political winds shifted around them, while the local population found themselves caught between competing forces they barely understood. On September 3rd, 1961, Company A of the Irish 35th Battalion rolled into Jadotville aboard their trucks, dust kicking up behind them as they entered what would become their battlefield. At their head was Commandant Patrick Quinlan, a 42-year-old officer from County Kerry, whose weathered face and steady pipe-smoking demeanor masked one of the sharpest tactical minds in the Irish Army. Quinlan was no fresh-faced academy graduate. He was a soldier's soldier, a man who understood that preparation and vigilance were the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. The moment his boots hit the ground in Jadotville, Quinlan knew something was wrong. The air itself seemed to crackle with hostility. Local faces turned away when his men passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The Katangese gendarmerie, supposedly neutral forces, watched the Irish with undisguised suspicion, their numbers growing daily. It was like walking into a trap that hadn't been sprung yet, but every instinct Quinlan possessed told him it was coming. While diplomatic games played out in air-conditioned offices hundreds of miles away, Quinlan made a decision that would save the lives of every man under his command. He ordered his soldiers to dig, not the shallow foxholes of a temporary position, but deep, proper trenches that would turn their small compound into a fortress. The ground was like concrete under the African sun, each shovelful a battle against the earth itself. His men grumbled as they sweated and strained, wondering why their commander was making them dig graves in the middle of a peacekeeping mission. But Quinlan saw what others missed. The roadblocks that appeared overnight on routes leading to and from Jadotville weren't random security measures. They were the methodical preparation of a trap. The increasing patrols of Katangese forces weren't casual shows of strength. They were reconnaissance, mapping every inch of the Irish position. When Quinlan requested reinforcements or evacuation from UN headquarters, his pleas fell on deaf ears. The bureaucrats in their safe offices couldn't comprehend what the man on the ground was telling them, that Jadotville was about to become a killing ground. As September wore on, the noose tightened around Company A. Every day brought fresh signs of the storm brewing on the horizon. Weapons appeared in civilian hands. Mercenaries, hard-faced Europeans with the cold eyes of professional killers, were spotted moving through the area. The Katangese gendarmerie grew bolder, setting up positions that effectively surrounded the Irish compound. It was psychological warfare at its finest, designed to break the morale of the peacekeepers before the first shot was fired. Unknown to Quinlan and his men, the United Nations was preparing Operation Morthor, a massive military action designed to crush Katanga's rebellion and arrest its leaders. The operation was so secret that even the soldiers who would bear its consequences were kept in the dark. As UN forces prepared to strike at the heart of Katangese power in Elizabethville, Company A remained isolated in Jadotville, completely unaware they were about to become pawns in a much larger game. The irony was bitter. These Irish soldiers, sent as peacekeepers to protect civilians and maintain stability, found themselves abandoned by the very organization they served. While UN commanders plotted in secret conference rooms, 156 young men prepared for a battle they didn't know was coming, led by an officer whose warnings had been ignored. On the morning of September 13th, 1961, as dawn broke over the African landscape, many of Company A gathered for open-air mass. It was a scene that would have been familiar in any Irish village, soldiers bowing their heads in prayer, while their chaplain offered blessings for the day ahead. The irony of the moment would become clear within hours, as these men seeking divine protection were about to face a trial that would test not just their faith, but their very souls. At exactly 4 o'clock that morning, Operation Morthor began in Elizabethville, nearly 200 kilometers away. UN forces moved to arrest Chombe and his government, expecting swift success. But the Katangese weren't caught off guard. They had their own plans, and at the center of those plans was the isolated Irish company in Jadotville. What the UN commanders didn't realize was that by launching their surprise attack, they had just signed the death warrant for every Irish soldier in Company A. The pieces were now in motion for what would become one of the most extraordinary military actions in modern history. 156 Irish soldiers, led by a tactical genius they barely knew they possessed, were about to face odds that would have broken most military units before the fighting even began. But these weren't most soldiers, and their commander wasn't most officers. They were about to prove that sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior numbers or firepower, but from courage, skill, and an absolute refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. The attack came like thunder from a clear sky. At 7:40 in the morning on September 13th, as Father Tommy Quinlan raised the communion cup during Mass, the crack of rifle fire shattered the peaceful moment. Private Billy Reddy, standing sentry duty, had spotted movement in the tree line. 20 Katangese soldiers were advancing in attack formation, their weapons trained on the Irish compound. Reddy's warning shot rang out across the camp, sending soldiers diving for cover and scrambling for their weapons. In those first chaotic seconds, everything Commandant Quinlan had prepared for came into sharp focus. His men, jarred from their morning prayers, moved with the discipline of weeks of training. They sprinted to the trenches their commander had forced them to dig, those back-breaking ditches that had seemed so pointless just moments before. Now those trenches were the only thing standing between them and certain death. Quinlan appeared at the center of his defensive perimeter, his pipe still clenched between his teeth, calmly assessing the situation as bullets whistled overhead. What he saw would have broken the nerve of most commanders. The initial 20 attackers were just the beginning. Streaming down from the hills came wave after wave of Katangese troops, their numbers growing by the minute. 600 men in the first assault alone, with more reinforcements visible in the distance. The Irish position was a nightmare from a tactical standpoint. They were completely surrounded, cut off from any hope of retreat or reinforcement. The roads leading to Jadotville had been blocked by the enemy, turning their compound into an island in a sea of hostile forces. Radio communications with UN headquarters were sporadic at best, crackling messages that painted a picture of chaos and confusion. Company A was on their own, facing odds that would have seemed laughable if they weren't so deadly serious. But Quinlan had one crucial advantage that his enemies didn't fully appreciate. His men weren't just soldiers, they were Irish soldiers, raised on stories of desperate last stands and impossible victories. More importantly, they were led by a commander who understood that defensive warfare wasn't about having the most men or the biggest guns. It was about making every shot count, every position unbreakable, and every enemy advance cost more than they were willing to pay. The first major assault came within the hour. Katanga's forces, supported by mortars and machine gun fire, launched a coordinated attack on the Irish perimeter. The sound was deafening, a constant roar of explosions and automatic weapons fire that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Mortar shells landed with earth-shattering force, sending geysers of dirt and rock into the air. Machine gun bullets swept the compound like deadly rain, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down and their movements quick and calculated. From his command position, Quinlan orchestrated the defense with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. He moved constantly along the trench line, appearing wherever the pressure was greatest, his calm presence steadying his men under fire. When enemy forces concentrated their assault on one section of the perimeter, Quinlan would shift his limited reserves to meet the threat. When mortar fire became too intense, he would order tactical withdrawals to secondary positions, only to counterattack when the enemy advanced into the kill zone. The Irish weapons were woefully inadequate for the battle they found themselves fighting. They had Bren light machine guns, reliable but limited in their firepower compared to the heavy weapons arrayed against them. Their mortars were effective, but few in number, forcing the gun crews to make every shell count. Most of the men carried Lee Enfield rifles, bolt-action weapons that required skill and precision to use effectively. Against an enemy armed with automatic weapons and supported by artillery, it should have been a massacre. Instead, it became a masterclass in defensive tactics. The Irish used their limited firepower with surgical precision, picking their targets carefully and making every shot count. Their mortars found enemy positions with deadly accuracy, silencing machine gun nests and breaking up attack formations before they could gain momentum. Most importantly, they fought with the discipline of professional soldiers, never panicking, never breaking ranks, always following orders even when those orders seemed to lead straight into hell. As the first day wore on, the pattern of battle began to emerge. The Katanga's forces would mass for an assault, their numbers growing until they seemed to cover the landscape like an army of ants. Then would come the preparatory bombardment, mortars and machine guns raking the Irish positions in an attempt to soften them up. Finally, the infantry assault, hundreds of men charging across open ground toward the Irish trenches, expecting to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Time after time they were wrong. The Irish defensive fire was devastating in its accuracy and timing. Quinlan had positioned his men to create overlapping fields of fire, turning the approaches to their position into killing grounds where no enemy could advance without exposing himself to multiple weapons. When the Katanga's forces got close enough, the defenders would rise from their trenches like ghosts, pouring rifle fire into the attackers at point-blank range before melting back into their positions. By nightfall on the first day, the ground around the Irish compound was littered with Katanga's dead and wounded. The attackers had suffered casualties that would have broken most military units, yet they showed no signs of giving up. If anything, their determination seemed to increase with each failed assault. Fresh troops arrived throughout the night, replacing the dead and wounded, preparing for another day of battle. Inside the Irish perimeter, Quinlan took stock of his situation. His men had performed magnificently, but the cost was beginning to tell. Ammunition was running low, with every bullet now precious beyond measure. Water was becoming critically scarce under the blazing African sun, and the men were showing signs of exhaustion from the constant stress of combat. Medical supplies were adequate for now, but any serious casualties would quickly overwhelm their limited resources. Most troubling of all was the complete absence of any word from UN headquarters about relief efforts. The radio messages that did get through painted a picture of confusion and political maneuvering, but nothing concrete about when help might arrive. Company A was fighting for its life, while bureaucrats debated policy in air-conditioned conference rooms hundreds of miles away. As the sun rose on September 14th, the second day of the siege began with a sound that chilled the blood of every Irish soldier. The roar of jet engines echoed across the compound as a Fouga Magister fighter bomber swept low over their positions. The aircraft bore the markings of the Katanga's Air Force, but everyone knew it was flown by European mercenaries, professional pilots who brought decades of combat experience to bear against the trapped peacekeepers. The bombing run that followed was surgical in its precision and devastating in its impact. High-explosive bombs cratered the compound, destroying vehicles and communications equipment. The Irish had no anti-aircraft weapons, no way to fight back against this new threat from above. They could only hunker down in their trenches and endure, watching helplessly as their defensive positions were systematically targeted from the sky. When the dust settled from the air attack, the situation had gone from desperate to catastrophic. Company A was now completely cut off from the outside world, their vehicles destroyed, their communications severely damaged. They were trapped in a shrinking perimeter, facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour, while their own resources dwindled toward nothing. But still they held, still they fought, and still their commander moved among them with unshakable calm, his presence alone worth a battalion of reinforcements to the young men who looked to him for leadership. The Siege of Jadotville was entering its most critical phase, and the true test of Irish courage was about to begin. The morning of the second day brought with it a realization that would have shattered lesser men. As Quinlan surveyed the damage from the air attack, the scope of their isolation became crystal clear. The twisted wreckage of their vehicles lay scattered across the compound like broken toys. Radio equipment sparked and smoked, cutting their already tenuous links to the outside world. They were alone in a way that few soldiers in modern warfare ever experience, truly and completely cut off from any hope of immediate rescue. Yet something remarkable happened in those dark hours after the bombing. Instead of despair, a different kind of energy began to flow through the Irish ranks. These young men, many of whom had never fired a shot in anger before arriving in Africa, began to transform into something harder, something more dangerous. The realization that they could depend on no one but themselves didn't break their spirit. It forged it into steel. Quinlan recognized the change immediately. He had seen it before in veteran soldiers, that moment when fear transforms into focused determination. His men were no longer thinking about home, about the lives they had left behind in Ireland. They were thinking about the man next to them in the trench, about holding their piece of ground, about making the enemy pay for every inch they tried to take. It was a transformation that turned ordinary young men into warriors. The second day's fighting began with a ferocity that dwarfed anything from the day before. The Katangese commanders, frustrated by their losses and emboldened by the success of their air attack, threw everything they had at the Irish position. Artillery shells screamed overhead, exploding with bone-shaking force. Machine gun fire swept the compound in deadly patterns, forcing the defenders to time their movements between the deadly sweeps. But the Irish had learned from the previous day's fighting. They moved with the fluid grace of soldiers who had found their rhythm in battle. When enemy fire became too intense in one section, they would melt away to secondary positions, only to reappear where the enemy least expected them. Their return fire was economical but devastating, each shot carefully aimed and timed for maximum effect. Private Johnny Gorman, barely 17 years old, found himself manning a Bren gun position that had become a focal point of enemy attention. Shell after shell landed around his position, filling the air with deadly fragments. Yet he held his ground, his weapon chattering out measured bursts that cut down Katangese attackers with mechanical precision. Between attacks, he would clean his weapon with the methodical care of a master craftsman, knowing that a jammed gun meant death for his comrades. Sergeant Paddy Mullins, a veteran of border duty back home, had become the compound's unofficial sniper. With his Lee Enfield rifle, he picked off enemy machine gunners and mortar crews with shots that seemed impossible under the circumstances. His calm voice could be heard throughout the position, calling out targets and coordinating defensive fire with the steady professionalism of a man born for war. The enemy adapted too, bringing forward their own specialists to counter Irish tactics. European mercenaries, veterans of conflicts across Africa and beyond, began to direct the attacks with professional skill. These weren't local soldiers driven by political passion. These were cold-blooded killers who understood the science of warfare, men who killed for money and had grown very good at their trade. Under their guidance, the Katangese forces began to employ more sophisticated tactics. Instead of mass frontal assaults, they launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions, probing for weak points in the Irish defense. They brought forward mortars and positioned them with mathematical precision, walking their fire across the compound in patterns designed to force the defenders into predetermined kill zones. The psychological pressure was immense. The constant noise of battle, the acrid smoke of explosives, the sight of comrades wounded and bleeding, all combined to create a stress that pushed men to their breaking points. Yet somehow, the Irish held together. Quinlan's leadership was crucial, but it was more than that. These men had discovered something about themselves that they never knew existed. As the second day wore on, ammunition became a critical concern. Every bullet was now accounted for, every mortar round carefully rationed. The Irish had to make impossible choices, deciding which attacks to meet with full force and which to endure with minimal response. It was a deadly game of resource management, played out under enemy fire. Water became equally precious. The African sun beat down mercilessly, and the physical demands of combat left men desperately thirsty. Quinlan had ordered every available container filled before the fighting began, but even those supplies were running dangerously low. Men shared water bottles with the discipline of seasoned campaigners, each taking only what he absolutely needed to function. Medical supplies presented another challenge. The Irish had been fortunate so far, suffering only minor casualties despite the intensity of the fighting. But every bandage used, every dose of morphine administered, brought them closer to a crisis point where they would be unable to treat serious wounds. The knowledge that help might not come added urgency to every medical decision. Throughout it all, Quinlan remained the steady center of Irish resistance. He seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing beside a wounded soldier to offer encouragement, conferring with section leaders about ammunition distribution, personally sighting mortar fire on enemy positions. His pipe had long since gone cold, but he kept it clenched between his teeth like a talisman, a small piece of normalcy in a world gone mad. The third day dawned with ominous silence. No morning attack came, no preparatory bombardment. The Katangi's forces seemed to be regrouping, preparing for something different. Through binoculars, Irish observers could see massive troop movements in the hills surrounding their position. Fresh units were arriving, artillery pieces being positioned, supply columns bringing ammunition and equipment. It was clear that the enemy was preparing for a final, overwhelming assault designed to crush Irish resistance once and for all. The numbers were staggering. Intelligence estimates suggested that nearly 4,000 enemy troops now surrounded the compound, supported by artillery, mortars, and air power. Against this force, Company A could field fewer than 160 effective fighters, armed with weapons that were already running short of ammunition. Yet morale in the Irish ranks remained surprisingly high. The men had discovered something powerful about themselves and their unit. They had faced the worst the enemy could throw at them, and not only survived, but inflicted casualties that should have broken their attackers' will to fight. They had proven to themselves that training, discipline, and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The waiting was almost harder than the fighting. Men cleaned their weapons obsessively, checked and rechecked their ammunition supplies, wrote letters they knew might never be delivered. Some prayed quietly in their trenches, while others shared stories of home, keeping their spirits up with memories of a world that seemed impossibly far away. As afternoon approached, the enemy bombardment began with an intensity that dwarfed everything that had come before. The ground shook continuously under the impact of shells and mortars. The air filled with smoke and dust until visibility dropped to mere meters. It was preparation for what everyone knew would be the decisive battle of the siege. When the barrage finally lifted, the attacking force that emerged from the smoke was unlike anything the Irish had faced before. Thousands of men advanced in coordinated waves, their movements directed by professional officers who understood the mathematics of overwhelming a defensive position. This wasn't desperation or political fervor driving the attack. This was military science applied with ruthless efficiency. The Irish response was everything Quinlan had trained them for. Disciplined fire met the advancing enemy, every shot aimed with precision born of days of combat experience. Mortars found their targets with deadly accuracy, breaking up attack formations before they could gain momentum. Machine guns swept predetermined fields of fire, creating zones of death that no living thing could cross. But the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. For every enemy soldier cut down, Two more seemed to take his place. Ammunition ran lower with each passing minute, forcing impossible choices about which targets to engage. The Irish perimeter began to contract as outer positions became untenable, falling back to secondary lines prepared for just this moment. The battle raged through the afternoon and into the evening, a continuous roar of gunfire and explosions that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. By nightfall, Company A had been compressed into a tight defensive ring around their command post, their ammunition nearly exhausted, their water supply critically low. Yet they still held, bloodied but unbroken, reduced to a fraction of their original defensive area, but still fighting with the professional skill that had marked their resistance from the beginning. As darkness fell on the third day of the siege, both sides knew that the final act of this drama was approaching. The question was no longer whether the Irish could hold indefinitely, but how much more they could make their enemies pay for victory. The morning of September 17th brought with it the bitter taste of reality. After 5 days of holding the impossible, after inflicting casualties that should have broken any attacking force, after proving that courage and skill could overcome overwhelming odds, Commandant Quinlan faced the hardest decision of his military career. With ammunition down to a handful of rounds per man, water supplies nearly gone, and no word of relief from UN headquarters, he accepted the inevitable. The surrender, when it came, was not defeat but the final act of extraordinary leadership from a commander who had kept every one of his men alive through hell itself. The aftermath told the true story of what had transpired at Jadotville. 300 enemy dead, over 1,000 wounded, against 5 Irish casualties. Numbers that spoke louder than any official report ever could about what had really happened in that small compound in the heart of Africa. These weren't just statistics. They were proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from simply refusing to break when everything around you is falling apart. For decades, the men of Company A would wait for recognition that never came. The very organization they had served would bury their story, embarrassed by the failure of Operation Morthor and unwilling to acknowledge the extraordinary courage of soldiers who had been abandoned to face impossible odds. It would take over 40 years for Ireland to officially recognize what the rest of the military world had known all along, that Jadotville had been one of the finest examples of defensive warfare in modern history. But recognition, when it finally came, could never capture the real legacy of those 5 days in September. It wasn't about medals or official acknowledgement. It was about ordinary young men who discovered they were capable of extraordinary things when everything depended on them. It was about leadership that valued lives over glory, tactics over bravado, and preparation over hope. Today, military academies around the world study the defense of Jadotville as a textbook example of how small units can hold against overwhelming odds. The tactics Quinlan employed, the defensive preparations he insisted upon, the way he managed resources and maintained morale under impossible pressure, all of it has become required reading for officers who may one day face similar situations. The Siege of Jadotville stands as proof that heroism doesn't always come with victory parades and glorious charges. Sometimes it comes in the form of young men digging trenches in hard ground, following orders they don't understand, trusting in leadership that sees dangers others miss. Sometimes it comes from simply holding your ground when everyone else has written you off, fighting not for glory but for the man standing next to you in the trench. 156 Irish soldiers went to Jadotville as peacekeepers. They came home as legends,